was really wondering how I wanted to start this talk. And I think I want to start off with a quick little story. I was a junior or senior in college, and I was in the public history lecture. And they said, we have decided we're going to build an exhibit for Fort Concho. It is going to be a series of 5 slides that will cover different aspects of the Red River Wars. Now, we're in college for history. We're all history majors, yet we all looked around and were like, what's the Red River War? And we started and we spent an entire semester putting together the basic facts, a way that was consumable for the public. We made it as consolidated as possible. And we sat there all leaving, kind of looking back now going, oh my goodness, that was definitely a junior in college's work. However, it was the start of us learning about the Red River War. Since then, I've become the educator here. And I've been spending a lot of time learning about military history and social history. And today is going to be more so of a social history type talk. There is a book out there, it's called The Battles of the Red River Wars. And in every piece of it, he uses archaeology work, and he put together an entire map of every battle, what weapons were used, the caliber of every weapon. He is way more qualified in telling you the battles. I want to give you more of the context. So, let us get into this talk. Oh, by the way, there's the opening presentation. So I like to frame my topics as a series of questions to be asking yourself as we go along in this conversation. When we talk about what started the war and what ended the war, we can talk for just about 30 minutes over each and still leave unsure. The conflict between settlers and Native Americans was always growing, but this is kind of the big finish for Texas. So the questions we will be exploring today are, what is the Red River Wars? What are some of the reasons for the conflict between the Army and the Southern Plains tribes in Texas? Who instigated the conflict? Was it the Buffalo Hunters, one of the Southern Plains tribes? Was it the settlers, or was it the government? It's quite easy to respond with all of them, and there is no right answer, but we will talk about that. How was Fort Concho involved? What happened from August of 1874 to the spring of 1875? And then we shall finish up today's talk with what was the result of the Red River Wars, and how did it impact West Texas and the industry out here? So around the year 1795, the Comanche and Kiowa formed a confederacy. Their relationship did not start out strong, and their records up to the 1820s showing how the Comanche viewed the Kiowa as weak, and the Kiowa early on used their relationship with the military to attack their fellow members of the Comanche. However, the confederacy was formed out of a necessity with a rising population of settlers. The Cheyenne and the Arapaho added to the confederacy in about 1840, and they made up the core of the Edge Southwestern Plains tribes that will be discussed today. The conflict between tribes and settlers date back to the Spanish colonial era, but it was during the time of the Texas Republic that tensions escalated significantly. Books like Empire of the Summer Moon reveal that the tensions began very early, but none created such a profound rift as the Texas government's actions when it was an independent country. One pivotal moment in this long-standing conflict was the Council House fight. The Comanche were divided into several bands, and one band, the Pentaka Comanche, traveled to San Antonio to negotiate the peace treaty with the Texas government. Unfortunately, they were lured under false pretenses. Suffering from previous attacks and smallpox, the chief's warriors came to discuss peace. Understanding Native American society during this time was complex, and as the tribes were often mischaracterized or lumped together. For instance, Texans frequently grouped various tribes as if they all had the same practices and customs. This misunderstanding is like what led to a similar conflict with the Nez Perce back in the 1880s, when a treaty was signed with one of the bands, but not the other, and it led to a conflict with the Army, and is actually one of our examples of the use of the 1841 mountain howitzer. So at the council house, Chief Mukwahara and the other Comanche chiefs were met with shocking news that they were to be held hostage under captives from other bands were returned. It was something the Texans could not guarantee. Their attempt escape. So sorry. The Comanche could not guarantee that one band had the captives, right? Yet the other half that they were trying to convince them, like, hey, give us over our hostages. They were like, no, we're actually not going to do that because we have no control over the Quijada band. And they're like, well, you're a Comanche. They're a Comanche. So why don't y'all give over the hostages? That's what the Texas government was basically trying to say. Now, that didn't end well. There was about 35 Comanche killed that day. It specifically, they killed 5 women and children along with all the rest. Multiple of the Comanche left that day, but there was just absolute tensions that were born that day. The Native Americans were viewed as the enemy. We see that again in things like the Battle of Dove Creek when the Civil War and specifically the Confederate State Guard worsened tensions with Native Americans. But you have to also understand, newspapers published reports of Comanche raids in vivid detail. They discussed that those who were harmed, and they gave vivid accounts of the harm done to the settlers of Texas. The stories became somewhat sensationalized to those who lived in the eastern parts of the country. But for those who lived in Texas, they saw it as a warning. Settlers quickly understood moving beyond the protection of the trees in East Texas was a risk. Those who were brave enough to go onto the frontier away from army posts understood they did it with a risk both to their family, to their industry, their work, and those they employed, with death being a possibility. The railroad at this time only went as far as Hempstead. In 1874, it actually got all the way to Dallas, but that was its furthest point. Now, I cannot stress this enough. Leading up to 1874, everyone and their mother were terrified of the Comanche and Native Americans out here. Grant's 5-year peace policy. So President Ulysses S. Grant created a strategy in 1869 to reform the U.S. government's approach towards Native American relations. The policy aimed to reduce violence, prevent corruption in the Indian affairs system, and ultimately assimilate Native Americans into American society. The military was considered in peacetime following the Civil War, and the Army was in the process of cutting down to their desired numbers of only 25,000 men to operate across the western frontier. So the key components included appointment of religious leaders as Indian agents. There was a noticeable amount of corruption within the Indian affairs system, and Grant saw appointing Quakers and Protestants as a solution, as they were known as peaceful. And within religion behind them, they were hoping it would promote moral governance on the reservations, being fair and just. They established the boards of Indian commissioners, a civilian body designed to oversee Indian Bureau's operations and ensure that the peace policy was being implemented effectively and ethically. Now, the commissioners were not to be tied to political interest. There was a focus on assimilation. They wanted the tribe members to become a part of American society, when in all reality, we now understand that they wanted more so to eradicate Native American culture. There was a concentration on reservations. The policy encouraged the concentration of Native Americans onto reservations where they could be closely supervised. The government desired a control to regulate their interactions with the settlers and wider American society, while also taking possession of the land that the Native Americans had used for years to hunt on. Grant's peace policy also pushed for the reduction of military confrontations with Native American tribes. Grant aimed to end violent conflicts that characterized U.S. Native American relations by implementing peaceful negotiations and treaties. Now, though many aspects of this were fraught, conflicts between the settlers and Native Americans continued. Buffalo hunters and settlers paid little heed to regulation and treaties made with the Native Americans, and it created conflict. And despite the appointment of religious leaders, corruption and mismanagement persisted. So the policy also failed to respect the cultural autonomy and the rights of Native Americans, and it led to further displacement. It was the loss of traditional lands and the destruction of cultural practices. Now, Here's another reason tensions died a little. So Sherman is involved in all of this. Yeah, that's Sherman from the Civil War. In Washington, D.C., Chief of Staff, who became General of the Army, William Tecumseh Sherman, was receiving almost daily outcries from from the settlers about full-scale depredations from the Indians. He doubted the validity of these reports and considered them greatly exaggerated, but settlers continued their pleas for him to end the carnage and get out there and do something about it. So at some point, General Sherman traveled from Washington, D.C. to San Antonio to begin an inspection tour of the Texas frontier. His entourage included his personal staff, which was Inspector General R.B. Marcy, and an escort of 17 cavalrymen from 10th Cavalry. And they departed from San Antonio on April 28th, 1871. They went to Fort McCavitt, they went to Fort Concho, and they went to Fort Griffin. Now, there was one among their staff, Marcy. He looked around, and even though Sherman was looking, and he's like, wow, everything out here is just going so splendidly. Look at how the Army's doing its thing. Marcy was like, there's a lot of less people out here. There's a population decline, and there was. In 1871, there was a clear decline of population in West Texas, and Marcy made note of that in his records. So at Fort Griffin, Sherman was told all these stories of capture, torture, and death, and local residents urged him to send out soldiers. And before leaving, Sherman actually even met the son of President Grant, who was actually at Fort Griffin at the time. So then they went from Fort Belknap all the way to Fort Richardson on May 18th, 1871. Now, as they were at Fort Richardson, they got a knock on the door. And they opened it, and there were two Teamsters that sat there, completely bloodied, saying, "We need help. Our entire train has been massacred." And Sherman, listening to their story as it unfolded, recognized that route he had taken. It was his route, the route he had taken the day before. Simply by luck, Santana, who was one of the tribesmen present there who gave his account, mentioned how they saw Sherman's party ride by. However, the Kiowa War Party decided they would go after the Warren train, realizing that maybe it would be more lucrative. However, not realizing they were this close to killing the general of the army that day. Now, there are many moments that we can point to when the Army shifted its Indian policy, but nothing was quite as effective as making it personal for Sherman. Sherman sent out Mackenzie in the Army while falling under Grant's policy, but also began a more effective campaign on Native Americans. We had the Battle of Remolino in 1873. 4th Cavalry was sent out on a multitude of scouting expeditions. Mackenzie, if y'all aren't aware, he's basically Sherman's personal attack dog, and he was one of the most effective graduates from West Point out here in West Texas. Now, Sherman was listening, and Sherman was going to make a change. But with all of this context, let's jump into 1874. So in 1874, the Battle at Adobe Walls is often cited as the beginning of the Red River Wars. The Army did not have a part, but instead it was part of the Buffalo Hunters town. On the morning of June 27th, 1874, elements of the Cheyenne, Comanche, Kiowa, and Arapaho had formed a war party and led a raid on Adobe Walls. Quanah Parker was among those present. The raid led for half a day, but was considered a failure by the tribe members present that day. The war party was led by Issatai's Medicine, or in plain terms, he spiritually believed that he could be unharmed along with the war party that day. But because that isn't what happened, they referenced it as bad medicine. The number of natives that killed that day are unknown, but it was somewhere between 50, 15, 70, and 115, depending on which account you want to follow. But only 2 white men died that day. To make it worse, a stray bullet actually killed Issatai's horse under the bad medicine. When the men rode into the stronghold the next day to find the scene, it was George Belfield, Jim, and Bob Cato. Henry Lease was also there, and he took one of the horses to ride to go get help after the conflict. And they rode off to Dodge City. Now, the department commander, General John Pope, was the officer for the region at the time. And when he heard the situation, he blamed the Dodge City buffalo hunters, who had a pattern of illegal depredations of Indian territory. He refused to send troops. And he said it was not only that, but it would break up any deals we had with the Native Americans in the area. It was your choice to be a buffalo hunter, even though we told you not to. And you were not going to receive any help. Now, Dixon, who was a buffalo hunter too, intercepted these gentlemen who were looking for help, and feeling hearing the story, decided to intercept and lead a counter conflict against the Native Americans, because he saw that the buffalo hunters needed to band together. Now, of this, it's worth noting, about 6 weeks later, Lieutenant Baldwin actually goes out with a couple of Kiowa tribesmen, and they go out to the site of the Battle of Adobe Walls so that the Native Americans could collect their dead. However, they were so angered by the conflict and by the buffalo hunters, they burned the entire place down. So, Kiowa's involvement was limited at the Adobe Wall. And when the tribe gathered after the conflict, the majority of the tribe was pushing for peace. There was Strike Eagle, who was the main one pushing for peace, with those such as Lone Wolf, who was absolutely pushing. It is time to respond. Now, at the Sundance, notably, Santana actually gave up his chief status, which we'll explore Santana in a second. And there was also one Kiowa named Mamanti, who planned the Kiowa raids, who was present, and he showed his support to Lone Wolf. And because of that, they were able to form a small war party. Once they all rode off that night, because they had decided to form a war party and lead raids, other tribes were also doing this at the same time, by the way. When they formed up, they painted themselves in their war paint, they put on their war garments, and they headed out towards Salt Prairie, which is near where the Warren train massacre had happened. They noted 4 cowboys that were riding around, and they decided to give chase. And the cowboys' horses were shod where the Native Americans were not, and they were able to get away by riding on a rocky area. Now, the Kiowa, recognizing that they were going to be entering rocky paths going forward, they decided to go ahead and start covering up the horses' feet with cattle hide from a calf nearby. And while they were doing that, they came across the newly formed Frontier Battalion of the Texas Rangers, led by Major John B. Jones. Now, it's worth noting the former governor of Texas, Davis, had upset many and made decisions that were much unpopular, including a peace treaty with the Kiowa, along with the use of Texas Rangers as a police force, and it led to him being elected out and replaced by Richard Koch. Now, Governor Koch came in with the express desire to push out Republicans and carpetbaggers. He also became aware of the Army. Though they were fighting the Native Americans in Texas, he decided they were not doing enough and he needed better forces. And so he reestablished the Texas Rangers, and they made up a force of about 450 men with the sole job of protecting Texans. Now, in July 1874, they were fully formed, and a company of Rangers found the tracks of that Kiowa party that just gave chase to the cowboys. Now, the problem is the Kiowa also saw them, and the Kiowa rode off and found Comanche tracks and decided to make a split so it looked like the Native Americans went both ways. As they rode up, the Texas Rangers decided to split up in 2 groups. Now, despite the fact that these Texas Rangers came in with the intention to fight, they were all green. They had yet to face the Native Americans in conflict, and they were not aware of what they had just stumbled into. It was a trap. Splitting up was one of the oldest tactics in the books for Native Americans out here in West Texas. So the Kiowa rode off into the Lost Valley, with one group following them, while the other group was following the 2-day-old war party path the Comanche had laid down. Now, as they were riding in there, one private rode in ahead into the valley, not realizing that right above him was the Kiowa. As he was riding, he looked up, it was like, oop, and he set off his pistol, and he rode off immediately back to the captain saying, I found them, right? And so a conflict ensued. The Kiowa were present that day, obviously, this war party, and in it, what ended up happening was it was a chance for Lone Wolf to avenge the death of both his son and his nephews that were killed back at Adobe Wall. And so even though the conflict itself was only half a day, there was actually a friendly fire incident in it as well. The main idea was this was a war party setting of peace. And that's when it becomes apparent that Lone Wolf didn't actually look for conflict in the way that you think, but more so he was looking for justification and avenge. So many of these type of conflicts continued around Kansas and Camp Supply. They were going all the way down into Texas. Now, I'd mentioned the Quaker bit earlier, being a part of Grant's peace policy, and little help was coming from Indian agents. And in fact, they were appalled with such stories as the ones where tribes were being treated the way they were in such a warlike manner. Now, Agent Miles, who went to General Pope earlier in July with the stories, Pope was the guy earlier who said, yeah, we're doing nothing about it. You're the Buffalo Hunters. You knew better. Just a heads up. In early July, with stories about one above the others, and along with the lack of peace across the agencies, and Pope started to see just how serious it was with the Cheyenne that were leading war parties. It was going to be a situation where though the Comanche and Kiowa were also leading war parties, it was about to get a lot worse. And any sense of peace in Kansas was going to be dead. And it got to the point where they looked around and it looked like the entire western frontier was up in flames with the amount of war parties that were taking place. Now, in all of these conflicts, Sherman and Sheridan caught wind. Sherman was known for his temper, and he did not hide his like of General John Pope, but Pope had acted to maintain peace, but with the Department of Army now involved, it became clear that Grant's 5-year peace policy was coming to an end. On July 25th, 1874, after 10 days of planning, the military campaign for the Army had been planned. It was across multiple states with the purpose of chasing Native Americans, starving their horses, forcing hand, and forcing them onto reservations. Orders were sent out to Sherman, is quoted saying, "Settle this matter at once." Let's talk about Fort Concho's role in the Red River War. The Army at this time pushed regiments where they needed them, and any one regiment could be at a multitude of posts. This was the case for 4th Cavalry. We have records showing that Colonel McKenzie, along with 1st Lieutenant Reed and Lawton, left posts, probably orders sent out on July 25th when the campaign was planned, and they were to report to San Antonio. For August, multiple companies were packed up and prepared for movement from their spots at Fort Clark, Kerrville, and a couple other outposts, and were to move to Fort Concho, where the regiment was to form up and send on to the fork of the Brazos River, about an hour or so drive north of Fort Griffin. Elements of the 10th Infantry, 11th Infantry, 9th Cavalry were also assigned, along with elements of cavalry meant to help McKenzie with scouting, or to where the infantry was to provide supplies from Fort Griffin to the supply points. Many of these companies first went to Fort Concho for supplies before heading out. When people ask me how many people were stationed at Fort Concho, and we talk about numbers being low as a single company in 1889, this is where we start talking about it was the most busy at Fort Concho, August of 1874. Everyone and their mother was here. And I'm not even exaggerating. There were multiple mothers on officers' row. Families had to share the officer quarters during this time. While all the elements of 4th Cavalry, 10th Infantry, 11th Infantry, and 9th Cavalry formed up at the Brazos River, elements under Colonel Nelson Miles, a regimental commander of 5th Infantry, formed up at Fort Leavenworth to head south towards Paladero Canyon. Under his command, companies from 6th Cavalry and 5th Infantry were to set out in 3 columns, leaving August 11th through August 14th, heading for Camp Supply. Now, this is a side note about Colonel Miles. He never attended West Point. He was one of those that rose through the ranks during the Civil War by forming a regiment. Now, he also stepped on many, many, many toes to climb over other officers, and he was even friends with Custer, another unpopular choice. He was also married to Sherman's niece, becoming a nephew to the Department of Army head. To help ensure he was remembered, Miles had a scout who hated Indians and was a writer for Kansas Daily Common writing with him. He had openly expressed in a newspaper his dislike of General Pope, and when his columns were sent out on campaign, it was a determination to beat Mackenzie to conflict. Officers followed the guidance of the government is questionable. Their personal morals and beliefs affected how they did their job. If one officer hated the Indians, they acted with such intentions. Officers largely acted on their own accord as they were leading their regiment. And so Miles setting out to beat Mackenzie fits within the bounds of how they were trying to climb to the top. Now, the other thing to note when reading about the Red River Wars is the fact of Native American tactics. We see it back with the Kiowa and when the Rangers fought. We see a similar fighting style like this again in Vietnam. And the idea is it is easier to fight a couple at a time than the whole force at once. And that is something we see throughout the Red River Wars. So, excuse me. Here is a series of conflicts. We're going to jump into the major battle that defines the entirety of the Red River Wars. It's the Battle of Palo Duro Canyon. So the reason I bring this one up is there's moments where people are talking about which battle was the battle that defined the war. What was the moment the Native Americans were quelled on the Western frontier, if you'd like to word it that way? What was the moment? And a lot of people point to this moment led by Mackenzie. So what happened was Mackenzie was taking one of his old routes from the Brazos River heading north towards the Palo Duro Canyon when he caught some tracks. He's like, what are the chances? And so he sent out some Tonkawa and Seminole Negro Indian scouts to go out and look for those tracks. As they found them and they came back and they reported, they're in the Palo Duro Canyon. There was 3 camps. There was the Cheyenne camp, the Kiowa camp, and the Comanche camp. They were all together. Now, on the Native American side, Mama T, who was there, had received medicine that this was a safe location. They had no reason to worry, and the women of the camp were actually in the business of building teepee poles out of some of the trees that they had found in the canyon. There was a silence that had fallen upon the camp. Now, as Colonel Mackenzie led on September 28th, before the hours of the morning, he rode 3 companies in first. They rode straight down the canyon right up to the camps. At any single point, one tribe member could have looked up and saw them coming. However, the first gunshot goes off. Nothing. One of the Native Americans in the camp reported that day, yeah, someone's out deer hunting. They heard 4 more, and they're like, someone's still deer hunting and kind of a bad shot. And then the next thing you know, there's a complete gunfiring. However, Mackenzie's intention matched that of what Sherman had set forth. The idea was never to kill Native Americans in this conflict. It was to burn down their camps, and that's exactly what 4th Cavalry did. They rode in, they go through all of the camps. They started tearing down camps, killing animals. There was quite literally almost no bloodshed that day. Only 2 died in that entire battle. The bloodshed comes after the battle. After Mackenzie leads the raid through the camp, they burn all the camps. The Comanches start making their way towards the reservation. It's the end of the Comanches' reign. It's the end of the Kiowas' reign. It's the end of the Cheyennes' reign that day. Now, of course, there's a series of a couple more conflicts that will take place. On the previous slide, I pointed out a couple of the battles. But this is the effective end, and there's a reason for that. Mackenzie had learned his lesson about capturing horses and not killing them, because the Comanche had this tendency of taking their horses back and riding off. There is 2 estimates. I've seen the number 732 and I've seen the number 1064. Regardless, this is really big numbers. That's the number of horses the infantry killed that day. The idea behind it was kill off their way to get away. Tear down all of their camps. Make it so there's nowhere they can go. Winter is coming. September. It's only about a couple of weeks before it gets a little too cold to be out on the western frontier, and they were wanting to make their permanent camps for winter. Can't do anything if they don't have their horses. And so on that day, again, I can't stress that enough. 1,000 horses in a single day. It was effective. There's the expression I mentioned earlier that Mackenzie was Sherman's pit bull. It's kind of real. He was effective. Whether you love him or hate him, respect him or think he's disgusting, he got the job done that day. Now, in some of the reports I've read about this battle, there's of course question on the final numbers. However, there is an estimated about 15 killed that day, 2 being soldiers from 4th Cavalry, while another 13 or so that came from the Native Americans. It wasn't completely bloodless, but considering that there were thousands camped down there that day, it's quite the number. Let's go to this next part. Now, I would like to point out Satanta. He's a famous Native American that was present for the Red River Wars, and he originally was imprisoned because of the Warren Train Massacre. He was released in August of 1873 by an agreement made between the Kiowa and Governor Davis. However, the peace terms devolved quickly because we heard about all the raids they were leading, right? And though Satanta had given up as a war party leader, he was seen riding with the Kiowa, and it meant he was in violation of the parole agreement they had made with Governor Davis. And he was sent back to Huntsville September 17, 1874. Now, at this time, he was about 65 years old, and we don't know exactly his age when he was born. However, looking around in prison, he left a note saying that he could not survive anymore in this prison. He killed himself in 1878. Now, surely you can think everyone said, yeah, we're just going to go straight to the reservations. You got it. Thanks for killing our horses. That was not the response at all. And that is the reason why there was still a series of conflicts that took place afterwards. So what happened to the Native Americans? Largely, there were 2 options. Go to the reservation the government and Indian agents had arranged, or be in prison. 72 chose prison, and they were trained off to Florida from Fort Sill. The others were pushed onto the reservations. Largely, so Todd Smith explored in his book From Dominance to Disappearance, the Indians of Texas and near Southwest, how the power of tribes over the area had largely diminished by the time of 1874. This was the end. Now, I have this book here, and actually, I have this copy, and when I finish, I want you to take a moment to look at this book. There are 2 tribe members. Their names were Making Medicine and Zotom. And they decided to take one of the ledger books and draw up a series of images of what it was like being imprisoned after the Red River Wars. Now, one captain in particular, which his picture is broken, of course. Look him up. His name was Pratt. He was there, and he was in charge of helping make sure the Native Americans were settled in. However, in 1892, he had left watching over the Native Americans in 1878. In 1892, just about 15 years after Pratt had left St. Augustine, where the 72 had been imprisoned, he gave a speech at the National Conference of Charities and Correction in Denver, Colorado. And he was quoted saying, "A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one. And the high sanction of this destruction has been an enormous factor in promoting Indian massacres. In a sense, I agree with this sentiment, but only in this, that all Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man." Platt's thoughts lie within the wider Victorian ideals encouraging education. They saw the Native Americans out here as savages. They believed the only way the white settler could possibly live with the Native American was to erase their own history, to make them assimilate. Now, as soon as Pratt left the prison, he started the Carlisle Indian School, which was meant to civilize and Americanize the Native American children who were sent to that school. It is estimated 7,800 children attended this school from all over the country, and these children were stripped of their names and their heritage. These children experienced solitary confinement, and more than 180 children died over 39 years in the Carlisle Indian School. According to the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, it is estimated by 1926, 80% of Native American children were attending these style of schools. The sheer horror that came from these schools is still understood, and it was only a couple of years ago that one place was discovered a mass grave of 215 children who mildly went unnoticed outside of the community. I say all that because the entire source of it was because of the Red River War. Now, following this time, there's the other side. Texas became truly settled, if you will. The railroad was able to expand. Towns such as Midland and Odessa came about as the Texas Pacific Railroad began to lay tracks westward from Fort Worth. If you ever look at West Texas towns, you will notice along I-20, about every 20 or 30 miles or so in these small towns, they were actually water stops for the railroad. You probably actually may have had a chance of living in one of these small West Texas ghost towns. They were part of the railroad as it was able to connect because this area was considered settled. The other thing is the cattle industry. A lot of us out here were probably raised by farmers, or if not, we know someone who was raised by farmers out here in West Texas, the cattle industry specifically. A lot of the cattle industries were able to flourish starting after 1874 once the raids had died. Specifically, one aspect of San Angelo is the Goodnight Loving Trail. It started in 1874. Now, I do have to ask you out of curiosity, by raising your hands, who here has heard of the Red River Wars before? Not very many of us. And you're not alone. Like I had said at the beginning of this talk, I remember being a junior in college looking around going, I'm so sorry, the Red River Wars. But as you look around and leave here today, I want you to look around at all the railroad that we have going through this area. I want you to take a moment to think about the last time you drove through a really tiny town that wasn't connected to a Western frontier post. All of this was a result, partially, if not totally, because of the Red River War, yet it's something we never really think about anymore. I want to say thank you so much for your time today. I know some of this was really dark. I'm really glad you sat through all of this with me. One last thing. Oh, look, there's a railroad. I have two quotes from here. Sherman famously said back in the Civil War, war is hell. And then also I have Pratt's comment of kill the Indian, save the man. I want to say thank you for your time.